How could a quiet Polish nun, hidden from history, become the voice through which millions encountered God's immeasurable mercy today? Welcome, dear listener, wherever this story finds you tonight. Share this quiet hour with our growing community, and before we begin, subscribe to the Saint Lives so these stories continue. This is the hidden pilgrimage of Helena Kowalska, a poor Polish girl who became Sister Faustina, endured misunderstanding, illness, and spiritual darkness, and entrusted to the world a message of divine mercy that continues to soften wounded hearts across generations. And so the story begins not beneath the gold of a cathedral, nor in the company of scholars and princes, but in a quiet Polish village, where the earth was worked by hand, and every season carried its own small hardship. On August 25, 1905, a daughter was born to Stanisław and Mariana Kowalski, a poor Catholic couple whose life was shaped by prayer, labor, and the uncertain rhythm of rural existence. They named the child Helena. She entered the world in Głogowiec, a small settlement near Świnice Warczkie, in a Poland that had not yet regained its independence and was still divided among foreign powers. The country itself seemed to be waiting for something, holding its breath between memories of suffering and hopes that could not yet be spoken aloud. In such a place, Helena's childhood unfolded without outward importance. There were no signs that the little girl would one day be known across continents, no earthly privilege to prepare her for a public mission, and no family wealth to place her among the influential. Her beginning was deliberately hidden, as though Providence wished to show that the work of grace does not require impressive surroundings. Her home was modest, and the family knew the discipline of necessity. Food had to be earned, clothing had to be mended, and the warmth of the household depended upon long hours of work. Her father was known as a carpenter and farmer, a man accustomed to rising early and carrying the weight of responsibility in silence. Her mother kept the household together with patience and devotion, teaching the children the simple practices of Catholic life. Prayer was not an ornament added to the day, it was part of the day itself. The family prayed in the morning, remembered God during their work, and turned toward the church when the bells called the village to Mass. For Helena, these habits became more than customs learned from her elders. They formed the first language of her heart. Years later, she would speak of her earliest desire for holiness as something that had awakened when she was still very young, perhaps around the age of 7. No one looking at her then would have imagined a mystical vocation. She was simply a child among children, small enough to be overlooked, yet sensitive to the unseen world that surrounds every human life. She watched the adults struggle, heard the tiredness in their voices, and gradually understood that love often expresses itself through sacrifice rather than grand words. The church in the village offered a different kind of atmosphere. Its walls held the quiet of centuries, and within them Helena encountered the mystery of the Eucharist, the image of Christ crucified, and the gentle protection associated with the Virgin Mary. These were not ideas to be studied from a distance. They became familiar presences woven into her imagination and her prayers. The face of Jesus, suffering and merciful, would remain before her throughout her life, though she could not yet have known how deeply that image would one day shape her mission. In the world outside the church, life was often marked by uncertainty. Poland's rural families lived close to the limits of survival, and childhood could not remain untouched by adult concerns. Helena would have seen that work was necessary, that illness could visit without warning, and that the poor possessed little protection against misfortune. Yet hardship did not make her heart hard. Instead, it seems to have deepened her awareness of those who suffered. The compassion that later became so central to her spirituality did not arrive as an abstract teaching. It grew quietly from the experience of living among people who knew hunger, fatigue, disappointment, and hope. There was also in Helena a quality of inwardness. Some children seek attention and companionship at every moment, while others carry a private world within them, listening more than speaking. Helena belonged to the second kind. She was not withdrawn from those around her, but she seemed able to remain alone, without becoming empty. The ordinary scenes of village life, a path beside the fields, the sound of animals in the yard, the smoke rising from a chimney, the distant ringing of church bells, could become occasions for reflection. Perhaps this is how her spiritual life first took shape, not through extraordinary visions, but through an attentive heart learning to notice the presence of God in what others passed by. In later years, Faustina would write about the immense mercy of God with a confidence that seemed far greater than her education or social position. But the roots of that confidence may be found in these early surroundings, where she learned that human strength is limited and that life depends upon gifts no one can create for oneself. The mercy she proclaimed was not sentimental. It was the mercy of the Creator who sustains the poor, forgives the sinner, and remains near to the weary. Before she could describe that mercy to the world, she first received it through the tenderness of her family, the patience of her parents, and the sacramental life of the Church. Her baptism marked her belonging to Christ, before she could understand what that belonging would demand. The name Helena accompanied her through childhood, carrying the promise of a life not yet revealed. Like every child, she possessed no clear map of the future. She could not know the wars that would scar her homeland, the convents in which she would serve, the illness that would weaken her body, or the hidden conversations that would be recorded in a diary after long nights of prayer. She knew only the small world given to her, and within that world she began to answer God in the only way a child can, through trust, wonder, and a heart slowly learning to listen. What does heaven see when it looks upon an unnoticed child? Perhaps not the achievements that history will later remember, but the quiet willingness to love, the first prayer whispered without witnesses, and the hidden tenderness offered to another human being. In the fields and lanes of rural Poland, Helena Kowalska was becoming the person whom grace would eventually call Faustina. Her pilgrimage had begun long before she understood its destination, and beneath the wide Polish sky, the smallest prayers were already becoming the first steps of a very long journey. From that hidden beginning, Helena grew toward adolescence in a world that expected children to become useful before they had finished discovering themselves. The years of childhood passed beneath the same bells and changing skies, yet the girl who had once listened quietly to the prayers of her parents was beginning to sense a deeper invitation within her. She did not possess the language to describe it, and she did not speak of it with the confidence of someone who had already chosen a path. It was more like a persistent warmth beneath the surface of ordinary life, a feeling that she belonged to someone beyond the visible world, someone who was patiently waiting for her answer. Helena attended school for only a limited time, as was common among poor rural families whose children were needed at home. Education was valuable, but daily survival came first. There were tasks to complete, younger members of the household to help, meals to prepare, and work that could not be postponed because the weather was changing or the family had little to spare. She learned early that love could mean setting aside personal wishes for the good of others. That lesson would later become one of the central foundations of her spiritual life. She would speak of obedience not as the surrender of dignity, but as a way of allowing love to become practical. In her family, faith was not separated from labor. A rosary could be prayed while hands were occupied. A prayer could be offered while walking. And a difficult day could still end with gratitude. Helena's first knowledge of God was therefore connected with the texture of work, the smell of bread, the fatigue of the body, and the simple reassurance that no hardship was invisible to heaven. Around the age of 9, she received her first Holy Communion, an event that would leave a deep impression upon her. For many children, that day is remembered through photographs, white clothing, family gatherings, and the excitement of receiving something long anticipated. For Helena, the Eucharist seems to have entered more deeply, as though she understood, even without theological words, that Christ was not merely an idea learned in catechism, but a living presence who desired to remain near her. The Eucharist would later become the center of her mystical life. But its beginning was quiet, hidden within the reverence of a child approaching the altar. When the ceremony ended, the village returned to its ordinary routine. There were fields to tend and chores to resume. But Helena carried within her a memory of intimacy that did not fade. As she grew older, she became increasingly conscious of the contrast between the life expected of her and the desire forming in her heart. A poor girl in rural Poland was expected to work, marry if possible, and help establish a household. Religious life was also possible, but convents usually required a dowry, and a family struggling to live could not easily offer one. Helena understood these realities. She was not a dreamer who ignored the needs of those around her. She knew what her family could afford, and she knew that her own wishes could place an additional burden upon them. For this reason, she did not immediately run away or force a decision. She tried to continue as an ordinary young woman, helping her family and accepting the responsibilities placed before her. Yet the call remained. Sometimes it appeared in prayer, sometimes in a sudden desire to be alone with God, and sometimes in an uneasiness that made the pleasures of ordinary life feel incomplete. What does a young heart do when it longs for a future that no one else can see? Helena did not yet know. She tried, as many people do, to place the longing beneath practical duties. After the First World War, Poland entered a difficult period of reconstruction, and families like the Kowalskis continued to face uncertainty. Helena eventually left home to seek employment, working as a domestic servant in order to support herself and assist her family. Domestic service required humility, endurance, and a willingness to remain unseen. She cleaned rooms, prepared meals, carried out errands, and served households whose circumstances were often more comfortable than those of her own family. Such work could be lonely. A servant lived within a household but did not truly belong to it, always conscious of the distance between those who gave orders and the person who received them. Yet Helena did not consider this labor beneath her. She tried to fulfill every responsibility carefully, and she used the quiet moments of the day for prayer. The kitchen, the corridor, and the courtyard became places where she practiced patience. Her spirituality was being shaped not in an atmosphere of constant peace, but through the daily discipline of serving others without recognition. There were moments when she allowed herself to imagine a different life. She was young, and the world around her contained music, friendship, conversation, and the possibility of marriage. She did not despise these things, nor did she consider ordinary human affection unworthy. But beneath every possibility lay the same interior question. Was she meant to give herself entirely to Christ? She had felt this desire since childhood, but now it pressed upon her with greater force. She spoke with her parents about entering a convent, hoping they might understand, yet their concerns were understandable. They knew the financial difficulties involved, and perhaps they feared that religious life was too demanding or uncertain for their daughter. Their refusal did not come from a lack of love. It came from the practical fears of parents who had little protection against poverty. Helena accepted their decision, at least outwardly, and returned to her work. But obedience to her parents did not erase the call. Instead, it taught her to wait. In that waiting, she began to learn that vocation is not always confirmed by immediate success. Sometimes it must pass through delay, disappointment, and the painful discovery that even those who love us may not understand what God is asking. Her heart remained restless, but it was a restless heart still seeking obedience rather than self-will. She continued to pray, to work, and to care for those entrusted to her. The years of service strengthened her in ways she could not recognize at the time. She learned how to endure criticism without retaliation, how to remain gentle when tired, and how to place another person's needs before her own comfort. These were not dramatic virtues, but they would later sustain her through the trials of convent life. The future apostle of divine mercy was first taught mercy through small acts performed in private, where no one applauded and no record was kept. Still, the tension within her continued to grow. A life of service outside the convent could be honorable, but Helena sensed that she was being invited into a more complete offering. The desire did not feel like an escape from responsibility. It felt like a summons to belong more fully to God, even if that belonging would demand the surrender of every familiar plan. She had not yet reached the moment that would finally overcome her hesitation. She was still standing between the visible life before her and the hidden road calling from within. And while she continued her duties among strangers, the question she had carried since childhood was drawing closer to an answer. The question that had followed Helena through her years of work and waiting could no longer remain safely within the quiet chambers of her heart. By the middle of the 1920s, she had reached the age when many young women were expected to choose a direction. Yet every ordinary path seemed to leave her with the same incompleteness. She had tried to accept the life placed before her. She had served faithfully in the homes where she worked, sent what help she could to her family, and continued to pray in the hidden spaces of each day. Still, beneath her patience there remained a conviction that Christ was asking for a greater surrender. It was not a conviction that made her restless in the careless sense. It was more like a quiet pressure, a hand upon the door of the soul, asking to be admitted. Helena did not know when the door would open, but she knew that she could not spend the rest of her life pretending she had not heard the knocking. In the summer of 1924, while she was living and working in Łódź, she attended a social gathering with other young people. The scene was ordinary enough, filled with music, conversation, and the innocent excitement of a temporary escape from daily labor. Helena was still a young woman, and there was nothing strange in her taking part in such an evening. Yet in the midst of the gathering, something occurred that would divide her life into a before and an after. As she later recorded, she experienced a vision of Jesus suffering, wounded and sorrowful, appearing to her in a way that awakened an overwhelming sense of urgency. The experience was not pleasant or entertaining. It brought her face to face with the suffering of Christ, and with the distance between the life she was living and the life she believed she had been called to offer. The music around her continued, but inwardly she was no longer present to it. The world that had seemed harmless a moment before suddenly appeared unable to answer the deepest cry within her. She left the gathering and went to the cathedral of Saint Stanislaus Kostka, where she knelt in prayer. There, in the stillness of the church, she sought the courage to respond. The precise details of the experience belong to the mystery of her private conscience, and it is wise not to make them larger than she herself made them. What matters is the fruit they produced. Helena understood that she could no longer postpone the question of religious life. She needed to leave behind the uncertain compromise in which she had been living and place herself entirely at God's disposal. She returned to her family and again expressed her desire to enter a convent. Her parents remained hesitant, concerned about the cost and about the future that awaited their daughter. Their resistance wounded her, but she did not turn against them. She knew that they were acting from fear and responsibility, not from cruelty. Yet after the experience in Łódź, the possibility of remaining indefinitely in domestic service seemed unbearable. The call had become too clear. Helena made the difficult decision to leave home and travel to Warsaw, carrying little more than the belongings she could manage, and the hope that somewhere a religious community would receive her. Warsaw was a large and unfamiliar city, marked by movement, noise, and the unfinished scars of war. For a young woman from a poor village, it could be overwhelming. She did not arrive with influential acquaintances or a recommendation from a priest who could open doors. She came as an unknown servant, seeking a place in which to give herself to God. Her first task was to find work, because she needed to support herself while searching for a convent. She entered domestic service again, living simply and saving what little she could. During the day, she performed the duties expected of her. At night, she prayed and considered where to go. She visited religious houses and asked whether she might be admitted, but the responses were often discouraging. Some communities required a dowry that she could not provide. Others may have wondered whether she had enough education or health for the demands of religious life. To the people who saw only her circumstances, Helena must have appeared unsuitable. She was poor, not highly educated, and without the social connections that could make an application easier. Yet she continued knocking. Each refusal could have been interpreted as a sign that she had misunderstood God. Each delay could have strengthened the argument that she should return to the life her parents had imagined for her. But she had learned to distinguish between discouragement and the deeper movement of grace. She did not demand that the world make room for her. She waited, worked, and kept searching. At one convent, she was told that she would need to save money for her trousseau and entrance expenses before she could be considered. The instruction was practical, almost disappointing in its simplicity. Helena had hoped for an immediate welcome, but instead she was given another period of waiting. She returned to domestic work, gathering the small amount required while continuing to pray. This delay became one of the hidden trials through which her vocation was purified. She had imagined that following Christ might mean leaving everything at once, but she discovered that even the beginning of religious life could require patience, labor, and the acceptance of ordinary conditions. Her holiness would not be built upon dramatic gestures alone. It would be built upon doing the next necessary thing with love. Eventually, Helena came to the convent of the Sisters of Our Lady of Mercy. She approached the gate with uncertainty and asked to speak with the superior. There was no public ceremony, no announcement, and no clear sign that history had arrived at a turning point. A poor young woman stood before a convent door, hoping that the people inside might recognize something she herself could barely explain. The superior listened, but the response was not immediately enthusiastic. Helena was not dressed as someone from a wealthy family, and she had no dowry to offer. She was asked to find the means to prepare herself before entering. Once again, the door did not open fully. Yet this time, the refusal was not final. The community had not dismissed her completely. A path, narrow and difficult, had appeared. Helena returned to her work, accepted the conditions placed before her, and continued saving. The convent was no longer an impossible dream. It had become a destination toward which she could move one small step at a time. During this period, her interior life deepened. She began to understand that a vocation is not proven by the intensity of one emotion, but by the faithful endurance that remains after emotion has passed. She had prayed for a place in which to serve God, and God seemed to answer by asking her to serve patiently before that place was granted. The same Christ who had met her amid music and confusion now accompanied her through rented rooms, unfamiliar streets, and the humbling labor of waiting. There were moments when she may have wondered whether her efforts would ever bear fruit. But she kept returning to the same trust. Finally, on August 1st, 1925, Helena was admitted to the congregation. She crossed the convent threshold at last, not as a celebrated visionary, but as a young woman who had learned to surrender her plans through repeated disappointment. The world outside continued in its noise, and almost no one noticed that an unknown servant had entered religious life. Yet within that quiet house, Helena's old identity was beginning to give way. The girl who had knocked so many times at a closed door was about to receive a new name, a new habit, and a new school of hidden obedience. She had entered the convent, but she had not yet discovered how much the convent would ask of her. The threshold Helena crossed in August of 1925 did not lead into a life of immediate consolation. It led into a school, and every school begins by teaching the student how little she yet knows. Within the convent of the Sisters of Our Lady of Mercy, Helena was no longer a young servant searching for a place to belong. She was a postulant, entering a disciplined world of prayer, silence, community life, and obedience. The change was outwardly visible. She exchanged her ordinary clothing for the modest dress given to women beginning religious formation, and the habits of her former life were gradually replaced by the customs of the congregation. Yet the most important change was inward. She had offered herself to Christ. But offering oneself is only the beginning. The offering must then be lived, day after day, in the presence of other people, under instructions one did not choose, through duties that might seem smaller than the dreams that first inspired the vocation. Helena had imagined that the convent would bring her nearer to God, and it did. but not always through the kind of nearness she expected. Prayer was governed by a schedule. Meals were taken with the community. Work began and ended at appointed times. Personal preferences had to yield to the needs of the house. Even moments of silence were not simply opportunities for private reflection, because silence also required restraint, patience, and respect for others. A person could enter a convent with a strong desire for holiness and still discover that she was impatient, sensitive, easily discouraged, or secretly attached to being understood. Religious life revealed the heart not only to God, but also to the person who carried it. Helena began the slow process of being known. During her early formation, she was given the religious name Sister Maria Faustina of the Blessed Sacrament. A new name in religious life is not meant to erase the person who came before. It is a sign that the person's identity is being placed within a new relationship, a new history, and a new offering. Helena remained Helena, with her memories of family, poverty, service, and longing. Yet Faustina expressed something she was being asked to become. The name recalled the saints and placed her beneath the sign of the Eucharist, which would remain at the center of her spirituality. She did not yet know that the name would one day be spoken in churches around the world. Within the convent, it simply belonged to a young nun who was learning how to fold her will into the rhythm of community life. Her duties were ordinary. She worked in the kitchen, helped in the garden, served in the bakery, and at times cared for the needs of the house through the porter's lodge. She was not placed behind a writing desk or given a public ministry. She was asked to wash, carry, prepare, clean, and assist. The work could be tiring, especially for someone whose health was not strong. It could also feel repetitive, as though each day were a copy of the day before. Yet repetition became one of the instruments through which her heart was purified. A single act of service can be performed with enthusiasm. The same act performed hundreds of times requires a deeper choice. It asks whether love depends upon novelty or whether it can remain faithful when no one notices. Faustina would later understand that the smallest duty, when offered to God, could possess a value greater than an impressive action performed for admiration. She did not need to be seen in order to be useful. She did not need to be praised in order to love. The kitchen became a chapel of a different kind, not because the pots and pans were sacred objects, but because the intention behind the work could be given to Christ. The garden taught her patience with growth that could not be hurried. The bakery connected her labor with the Eucharistic mystery, though the physical bread she prepared was part of ordinary nourishment. The porter's lodge exposed her to visitors, requests, interruptions, and the constant exercise of gentleness. These assignments were not chosen to create a dramatic biography. They were simply the places where obedience placed her. That was enough. In the early years, Faustina's interior life was not free from confusion. She desired to pray more deeply, yet prayer could sometimes feel dry. She wanted to become humble, yet the discovery of her own weaknesses could be painful. She hoped to be generous, yet fatigue or misunderstanding could make her defensive. The convent offered no escape from human nature. There were other sisters with their own temperaments, burdens, habits, and opinions. Some may have been kind to her, while others may not have understood her well. Faustina had to learn that charity did not mean waiting until everyone became easy to love. It meant accepting the imperfect community in which God had placed her. This was important, because her later mystical experiences would be judged through the ordinary reactions of those around her. If she had been unable to bear simple misunderstandings, she would not have been prepared to carry a message that many people would doubt. The Eucharist was her refuge. When she approached the altar, she brought not only her prayers but also the uncertainty of her vocation, the burden of her duties, and the longing that had followed her since childhood. Christ in the Eucharist was not an escape from the demands of community life. He was the one who gave those demands meaning. The more hidden her work became, the more she understood that she could unite it with the sacrifice of the Mass. To sweep a floor, prepare a meal, or accept a correction could become part of a daily offering when performed in union with Christ. The Virgin Mary also remained important in her spiritual imagination. Mary represented the perfect response to God's invitation, not through public power, but through availability, humility, and trust. Faustina looked toward her as a mother who understood hiddenness. Mary had carried the Savior without the world recognizing the mystery within her, and Faustina began to see that a soul could carry a divine mission while appearing completely ordinary to those nearby. The comparison did not make Faustina feel important. It made her feel small, and that smallness was comforting. She wished to remain hidden beneath the protection of Mary, doing only what God asked and leaving the results to Him. As her formation continued, she began to recognize that religious life would be less about escaping the world than about carrying the world before God. The congregation served young women and those in need of guidance, and even when Faustina's tasks were humble, they placed her near human weakness. She saw people who were lonely, confused, ashamed, or searching for a better life. Their struggles reminded her that mercy was not an ornament of devotion. It was a necessity for anyone who wished to live near Christ. A harsh word could deepen a wound, while a patient response might reopen the possibility of hope. Faustina was beginning to perceive that the spiritual life could never remain enclosed within private feelings. Prayer had to become a way of looking at other people. The girl who had once watched the suffering of her family was now learning to see suffering in a wider circle. Over time, her assignments took her to different houses of the congregation, including communities in Warsaw, Vilnius, and Płock. Each change required adaptation. A new convent meant new superiors, new sisters, new duties, and new expectations. Faustina could not build holiness upon a preferred location. She had to carry her vocation wherever she was sent. The movement from one house to another loosened her attachment to comfort and strengthened her dependence upon God. She began to understand that the place itself was less important than the fidelity with which she served there. Whether she stood in a kitchen or chapel, among familiar sisters or strangers, Christ remained the same. Her hidden life was becoming a steady offering, though the world still knew nothing of it. She had entered this convent with the hope of giving everything to God, and now she was discovering what everything meant. It meant time, strength, preferences, recognition, health, and the right to be understood. It meant allowing each day to become a quiet answer. The girl who had once waited outside a convent door was now inside, but the greatest lesson had only begun. She would learn that the true door into holiness does not open merely when a person enters a religious house. It opens each time the heart consents to love without being seen. The lesson of hidden love soon became more difficult than Faustina had imagined, because the convent did not simply conceal her from the world. It also revealed the movements of her own heart. A person can appear peaceful while remaining inwardly divided, and the first years of religious life brought Faustina into contact with the parts of herself she would rather have ignored. She had entered the congregation with a sincere desire for holiness, yet sincerity did not make her immune to discouragement. There were days when prayer seemed alive and close, and other days when the same prayers felt like words falling into an empty room. She could kneel before the tabernacle and find no consoling thought, no warmth, and no clear sense that God was listening. The absence of consolation frightened her at first. Had she misunderstood her vocation? Had she mistaken a passing emotion for a call? Was her desire to serve Christ genuine if she could not always feel his presence? These questions did not make her faith false. They made it human. Faustina's spiritual life was not a straight path from inspiration to certainty. It passed through the same uncertainty that troubles many faithful people, especially when a desire for God has become serious enough to expose every weakness. During the novitiate, she was taught the practices of the congregation, received instruction in the religious life, and prepared for her first vows. The discipline required her to examine her motives honestly. It was not enough to want the beautiful parts of holiness. She had to accept the hidden parts as well, including correction, inconvenience, silence, and the surrender of personal plans. The convent did not promise that every sister would understand her, and Faustina began to discover the pain of being seen imperfectly. A quiet person can easily be mistaken for a cold person. Someone who speaks little may be judged proud, while someone who is sensitive may be considered difficult. Faustina's interior experiences were not yet known to the wider community, and even when she tried to explain her struggles, she may not always have found the language or the listener she needed. Some people around her understood her kindness, while others may have noticed only her limitations. She had to endure the ordinary uncertainty of community life, where intentions are often hidden and judgments can be formed from incomplete impressions. This became one of her earliest lessons in humility. She could not control how others interpreted her. She could only choose how she would respond. At times, the temptation to defend herself must have been strong. When a person is misunderstood, the heart naturally wants to present evidence, correct the record, and secure sympathy. Faustina gradually learned to place that desire before Christ. She did not believe that every accusation was true, nor did she think that injustice should be celebrated. But she understood that holiness required freedom from the constant need to prove herself. If God knew her heart, then human misunderstanding could not finally destroy her. This was a difficult freedom, and she did not learn it in a single moment. It grew through many small acts of restraint, many prayers offered after an uncomfortable conversation, and many occasions when she chose peace over self-protection. Her devotion to the Eucharist sustained her during these struggles. She approached Holy Communion not because she always felt worthy or spiritually prepared, but because she believed that Christ came to heal the weakness she could not heal by herself. The Eucharist became the place where she could stop arguing with her own limitations. Before the altar, she did not need to create an impressive image of herself. She could bring her poverty, her confusion, her fears, and her longing. The Christ she received was the same Christ who had called her from the world, and his presence did not depend upon the strength of her emotions. When she felt nothing, the sacrament remained. When she doubted herself, the promise remained. In this way, Eucharistic faith taught her to distinguish between the reality of grace and the changing weather of the soul. Faustina also turned to the Virgin Mary, whose life appeared to her as a perfect school of hidden trust. Mary had accepted a mission she could not explain to everyone around her, and she had endured uncertainty without demanding that the future be shown in advance. Faustina sought to imitate that quiet availability. She wanted to say yes to God, not only when the path was clear, but also when obedience felt obscure. Mary's presence helped her see that a person could be entirely given to God without becoming publicly important. The hidden years at Nazareth became a source of comfort. If the Son of God had spent most of his earthly life in an ordinary home before beginning his public ministry, then an unnoticed life in the convent could not be considered wasted. The silence around Faustina's vocation was not necessarily evidence that nothing was happening. It could be the very place where God was forming her. Yet this conviction did not remove the darkness. Faustina experienced periods of spiritual dryness in which prayer required deliberate effort. There were moments of temptation, fatigue, and interior resistance. She sometimes felt a strong desire to withdraw from everything, not because she had ceased to love God, but because the demands of love had become heavy. The more sincerely she desired holiness, the more clearly she saw her incapacity. She understood that religious life would not turn her into an angel. It would teach her to let Christ act through a human person who remained vulnerable, emotional, and incomplete. This realization was painful, but it also protected her from spiritual pride. She could not claim holiness as a personal achievement. Every good movement within her appeared to depend upon grace. Her spiritual directors encouraged her to remain faithful to ordinary duties and to distrust dramatic impressions that were not confirmed by humility and obedience. Faustina tried to follow that guidance. She did not want to become attached to extraordinary experiences. If God wished to speak, she believed he could do so without making her important. If he wished to remain silent, she knew she was still bound to serve. This attitude would become essential later, when mystical experiences began to shape her life. Before she was asked to write words for the world, she had to learn that no private experience could excuse her from the responsibilities of the community. A vision could not replace obedience. A consoling prayer could not replace kindness. A feeling of closeness to Christ could not excuse impatience toward another sister. The test of spiritual authenticity would be found in charity. As the years passed, Faustina's commitment deepened. She made her first vows in 1928, offering herself through poverty, chastity, and obedience. The vows were not a declaration that she had overcome every struggle. They were a promise to continue walking through them with Christ. Her poverty reminded her that God alone was her lasting possession. Chastity directed her affections toward a wider love, asking her to become available to God and to the people he placed before her. Obedience required her to surrender not only possessions and relationships, but also the desire to determine her own path. She would not always understand why she was sent to one task or another. She would not always recognize the purpose of an illness, a delay, or a correction. Yet she chose to believe that grace could work through what she did not understand. In this way, the young nun was being prepared for a mission that would eventually include visions, writings, and a message addressed to the entire church. But the preparation remained hidden. It consisted of ordinary faithfulness, the quiet acceptance of limitations, and the daily return to prayer after discouragement. Faustina's soul was being stretched by the tension between what she desired and what she could accomplish. She wished to love God completely, yet she continually met the boundaries of her human nature. That tension did not destroy her. It taught her to rely upon mercy. When no light seemed to answer her prayers, Faustina learned to remain still, trusting that silence itself could be a form of grace. The silence that had tested Faustina did not remain empty forever. But when the light came, it arrived in a form that frightened her more than darkness ever had. By 1931, she had been living the hidden life of a religious sister for several years. She had learned to work without recognition, to accept correction without bitterness, and to pray even when her emotions offered little support. Her assignments brought her to the convent in Poix, where the rhythm of the house continued in its ordinary way. There were meals to prepare, duties to fulfill, prayers to attend, and the quiet movement of sisters passing from one responsibility to another. Nothing in the appearance of the convent suggested that it would become the place where a message destined for the whole church would first be entrusted to a young woman who still considered herself weak and unworthy. On the evening of February 22nd, 1931, Faustina experienced a vision that would change the direction of her life. She saw Christ as the merciful Jesus, clothed in white, with one hand raised in blessing, and the other touching his garment near the heart. From the place of the heart came two rays, one pale and one red, signifying the cleansing and life-giving grace that flow from the mystery of Christ's sacrifice. The image was not presented to her as a decoration created for personal devotion alone. It carried a summons. She understood that she was to have an image painted according to what she had seen, with the words, "Jesus, I trust in you." The experience was not a moment of triumph. Faustina did not feel that she had been chosen because she possessed unusual strength. Instead, she was overwhelmed by the responsibility. She had no artistic training, no influence, and no certainty that anyone would believe her. How could a poor nun, whose daily work was hidden from the public, arrange for a painting of a heavenly vision? How could she explain the details without appearing proud or confused? The very nature of the request seemed to place her in danger of misunderstanding. If she spoke, people might think she was seeking attention. If she remained silent, she feared she might be disobedient to the grace she had received. The tension between these possibilities pressed heavily upon her. Faustina's first response was not to celebrate the vision, but to question herself. She wondered whether the image had come from God, from her own imagination, or from a spiritual deception. Her concern was not merely intellectual. She knew that the Christian tradition warned against assuming that every interior experience was divine. A person could be moved by emotion, vanity, fear, or the desire to feel special. Faustina did not want to confuse a private impression with a command from Christ. The humble soul, when faced with something extraordinary, often becomes more cautious rather than more certain. She sought guidance and tried to submit the matter to discernment. Yet the image remained within her, not as a fading dream, but as a presence that continued to shape her prayer. The face of Jesus she had seen was not the face of an angry judge seeking to crush the guilty. It was the face of the Savior who desired to turn wounded people toward trust. This did not mean that sin was unimportant, or that repentance could be avoided. Rather, the vision revealed that divine justice could not be understood apart from divine mercy. Christ appeared wounded, and the rays flowed from his heart. The message was inseparable from the cross. Mercy was not cheap reassurance. It had been purchased through suffering, and it was being offered to those who were willing to receive it with humility. Faustina began to understand that the image was meant to remind people of a reality already contained in the gospel. It was not intended to replace the sacraments or the teaching of the Church. It was to become a simple sign pointing back toward Christ's love, especially for those who felt trapped in shame and despair. Still, the responsibility remained daunting. She could not paint the image herself, and she did not know where to find someone who would understand what she had seen. The request placed her in a position she had spent her life trying to avoid. She had wanted to remain hidden, yet now she was being asked to help make something visible. She had sought the safety of obedience, yet the command seemed to require initiative and persistence. The path of her vocation had changed, but not in the way she might once have imagined. She was not being invited to preach in public or to lead an institution. She was being asked to carry an interior message through the fragile instruments of human memory, human language, and human art. The words connected with the vision were simple. Jesus, I trust in you. They contained no complex argument and no promise that suffering would disappear. They expressed a decision to place the soul in the hands of Christ, even when the soul remained afraid. Trust was not presented as a mood. It was an act of surrender. Faustina would later repeat the words in moments of illness, doubt, humiliation, and spiritual darkness. They would become the heart of the image and the center of the devotion associated with her name. But at the beginning, they were a challenge directed toward her own heart. Could she trust Jesus enough to continue when the mission seemed impossible? Could she accept that the work might succeed without her being understood? Could she remain faithful if the image were rejected or distorted by human weakness? The vision in Poix did not answer these questions all at once. It placed them before her. During the days that followed, Faustina continued to carry out her duties. She did not suddenly become free from fatigue or ordinary responsibilities. She still lived among the sisters, still prayed according to the community schedule, and still had to perform the work assigned to her. The vision did not remove her from the world of small obligations. In fact, it made those obligations more significant. If the message truly came from Christ, then it would need to be protected by humility. She could not allow an extraordinary experience to make her impatient with ordinary people. She could not treat those who failed to understand her as obstacles to a divine plan. Mercy had to begin with the way she treated the women closest to her. She therefore continued to seek guidance, waiting for someone capable of helping her discern the meaning of what she had received. The image was not immediately painted, and the devotion did not spread quickly. There were delays, uncertainties, and moments when Faustina was tempted to believe that the mission would remain impossible. Yet the vision had already accomplished something within her. It had given a face to the mercy she had slowly encountered through the Eucharist, the cross, Mary, and the ordinary sufferings of human life. The mercy of Christ was no longer only a theological truth remembered from prayer. It had become a personal responsibility, a treasure placed in fragile hands. The hidden nun who wished to disappear was now being asked to carry an image meant for the whole world. She did not feel powerful enough for such a mission, and perhaps that was precisely why mercy could begin with her. The vision in Poix had given Faustina a mission, but it had not given her a clear method for fulfilling it. She knew that she was meant to speak of the mercy of Christ and to seek the creation of an image. Yet she also knew that a private impression could not be placed before the church without examination. The burden of discernment now became part of her vocation. She needed someone who could listen without being carried away by enthusiasm, and who could also recognize the possibility of genuine grace. Such a person would not simply accept every experience at face value. He would ask difficult questions, test the fruits, and direct her back toward obedience, humility, the sacraments, and the teaching of the Church. Faustina understood that this process might be slow, but she was willing to accept the delay. The message she carried would have no lasting value if it were built upon confusion. In the years following the Poix revelation, she continued her religious duties and waited for the circumstances that would allow the matter to be examined. She did not immediately find someone who could understand the depth of what she had experienced. The Church had always treated private revelations with caution, not because God could no longer speak to his children, but because human beings can misinterpret even what is good. A vision must be judged by its fruits. Does it lead to greater love, humility, obedience, and fidelity to Christ? Does it strengthen the life of the Church? Or does it create pride and division? Faustina's own fear of deception helped protect her from the temptation to treat herself as an authority. She did not want to become the source of a movement. She wanted to know whether God was asking her to serve. In 1933, Faustina was sent to the convent in Vilnius. The city, with its mixture of languages, histories, and religious traditions, was different from the places where she had previously served. Once again, she entered a new community and accepted another assignment, this time in the garden. The work was humble and physical. She tended plants, carried out tasks, connected with the grounds, and lived within the same pattern of prayer and obedience that had shaped her earlier years. Yet Vilnius would become a decisive place in her mission, because there she met Father Michał Sopoćko, the priest who would become her confessor and spiritual director. Their meeting did not produce an instant understanding. Father Sopoćko was a trained priest, a professor, and a man accustomed to considering spiritual claims carefully. He did not dismiss Faustina, but neither did he assume that every detail of her experience carried divine authority. His caution was important. A less careful person might have encouraged her imagination or allowed the mission to develop without sufficient spiritual foundation. Father Sopoćko listened, asked questions, and gradually observed the effects of her life. He saw a nun who was not seeking praise, who accepted correction, and who tried to obey even when obedience was difficult. He also recognized that her experiences were accompanied by suffering rather than self-exaltation. The more Faustina spoke of the mercy of Christ, the more she was drawn toward humility and service. For Father Sopoćko, these fruits mattered. They did not prove everything immediately, but they provided a basis for continued discernment. Faustina's relationship with her confessor became a place where her spiritual life could be tested. She could not simply follow every inner movement without guidance. When she believed that Christ was asking something of her, she brought the matter to Father Sopoćko. Sometimes he encouraged her. At other times, he required patience or asked her to wait. The experience may have been painful, especially when Faustina felt a strong interior urgency, but she accepted his authority. This obedience was not a form of passivity. It was a way of protecting the mission from her own fears and desires. If the message was truly from God, it could survive examination. If it was not, she wanted to be corrected before causing harm. A great deal of spiritual maturity is revealed by the willingness to be corrected. Faustina understood that humility was not merely speaking modestly about herself. It was allowing another person to question what she believed God had shown her. As Father Sopoćko continued to guide her, he encouraged her to write down her experiences. At first, the idea of recording such things must have been uncomfortable. Faustina was not a trained writer, and she had no desire to leave behind a personal monument. Her writings were meant to help her remember, to permit discernment, and to preserve what she believed she had received. The diary that emerged from this process would eventually become one of the most influential spiritual texts of the 20th century, but it began as an act of obedience by a hesitant nun. She wrote about prayer, temptation, suffering, visions, and the movements of her soul. She recorded her failures as well as her consolations. The pages did not present a person who had risen above ordinary weakness. They revealed someone who struggled, questioned, and returned again and again to trust. Writing also forced Faustina to distinguish between what she knew and what she merely felt. An emotion might be intense, but intensity did not make it true. A thought might seem beautiful, but beauty did not guarantee that it came from God. By placing her experiences into words, she could examine them more carefully. Father Sopoćko could read them, ask for clarification, and help her recognize whether they were consistent with the gospel and the spiritual tradition of the Church. The diary, therefore, became both a record and a discipline. It required Faustina to slow down, remember accurately, and submit her interior life to judgment. During this period, the request concerning the Divine Mercy image continued to develop. Father Sopoćko understood that Faustina could not accomplish it alone, and he began searching for an artist capable of translating her description into paint. The process was difficult, because no human artist could reproduce exactly what she had seen. Faustina sometimes felt disappointed by the result. The face of Jesus in the painting did not perfectly match the face she remembered, and the proportions or expression might have seemed inadequate. Yet she gradually learned that the image's power would not depend upon artistic perfection. It would depend upon the faith of those who looked upon it and turned their hearts toward Christ. The painting could be a sign, but it could never contain the fullness of the mystery it represented. This distinction protected her from treating the image as an object of magic. The devotion was not meant to lead people away from the sacraments or the cross. It was meant to return them to the living Christ, whose mercy is encountered through repentance, confession, the Eucharist, prayer, and acts of love. Father Sopoćko's guidance also helped Faustina understand that she was not to build the mission around her own personality. Her name might be attached to the message, but the message was not about Faustina. It was about Jesus. She was a messenger, and a messenger must not replace the one who sends her. This truth relieved her. She did not have to control the future or ensure that every detail unfolded according to her expectations. Her duty was to remain faithful to the instructions given through legitimate authority, to write what she could, and to trust that God would determine the results. The work advanced slowly, often invisibly, and there were still many reasons to doubt whether it would ever reach beyond a small circle. Yet a foundation was being laid. The vision had been tested by obedience. The message was being preserved through writing. The image was beginning to take form through human hands. Faustina's private experience was becoming connected to the wider life of the Church, not by force, but through patience and discernment. A private vision becomes a true test of faith when the soul must submit it to another's judgment. The guidance Faustina received in Vilnius gave shape to a mission that had once seemed too delicate to speak aloud. Under the direction of Father Sopoćko, she began to record the movements of her interior life with greater care. The writing did not come from a desire to be remembered. In fact, she often wished to remain hidden, and the thought that others might read her words could have filled her with uneasiness. She wrote because obedience required it, because memory could fade, and because the experiences entrusted to her needed to be examined in a form that could be preserved. In the quiet hours of the convent, sometimes after the household had settled into sleep, Faustina took up her pen and returned to the events that had marked her prayer. The pages became a place where she could speak honestly about the tenderness of Christ, the resistance of her own heart, the temptations that troubled her, and the suffering that accompanied her vocation. She did not present herself as a perfect witness. She described moments of light, but also moments when she felt weak, confused, or unworthy. The diary would later be read as a spiritual treasure, yet its first purpose was far more personal and demanding. It was a record written by a woman trying to remain truthful before God. Faustina understood that writing about divine mercy required her to confront her own need for mercy. She could not proclaim compassion as if she stood outside the human condition. She had to acknowledge her impatience, her fears, her attachments, and her uncertainty. The more she wrote, the more clearly she saw that the message was not built upon her strength. It was built upon the contrast between human poverty and divine generosity. God's mercy appeared great precisely because human beings were unable to save themselves. This truth was not an excuse for sin. It was an invitation to stop hiding behind despair and to return to the one who could heal what no person could heal alone. The words, "Jesus, I trust in you," became a simple expression of that return. They were not a promise every difficulty would disappear, nor a guarantee that prayer would always bring immediate relief. They were an act of surrender made in the presence of uncertainty. Faustina repeated them when she felt close to God, but also when she felt abandoned. She repeated them while carrying out routine work, while facing misunderstanding, and while thinking about the future of the mission. Trust had to become stronger than emotion. It had to remain when the heart was tired and when the mind was filled with questions. In this way, the phrase grew beyond the painted image. It became a spiritual posture, an invitation to stand before Christ without pretending to be self-sufficient. The central message Faustina received was that God's mercy is greater than human misery. Yet she learned that this message could be misunderstood if it were separated from repentance. Mercy does not tell a wounded person that the wound does not matter. It tells the wounded person that healing is still possible. It does not deny judgment, but it reveals that the final desire of God is not destruction. Christ seeks the return of the sinner, the restoration of the lost, and the freedom of those who have become trapped in shame. Faustina's writings often returned to the image of a soul approaching the merciful Savior with trust. She knew that many people remain distant from God because they are afraid of being condemned. Others remain distant because they presume they have no need of forgiveness. Divine mercy addressed both forms of distance. To the despairing, it offered hope. To the proud, it offered truth. To the suffering, it offered companionship. To the sinner, it offered the possibility of beginning again. As Faustina wrote, she also became more attentive to the connection between mercy received and mercy practiced. A person could not claim devotion to the merciful Jesus while refusing mercy to others. Prayer had to shape conduct. If Christ forgave, then his disciple had to learn forgiveness. If Christ noticed the forgotten, then the disciple had to notice them as well. Faustina's understanding of mercy was therefore concrete. It included patience toward difficult people, kindness toward the poor, compassion for the sick, and the willingness to speak gently when harshness would be easier. She believed that small acts performed with love could carry great spiritual significance. A glass of water, a word of encouragement, a visit to someone lonely, or the decision not to repeat another person's fault could become an offering. These actions did not appear impressive, but they allowed mercy to pass from prayer into the world. The message was also connected with the suffering and death of Christ. Faustina's visions never erased the cross. They directed her toward it. The rays flowing from the heart of Jesus reminded her that mercy had come through sacrifice. The red ray suggested the life given for humanity, while the pale ray suggested cleansing and renewal. The image invited people to look at Christ not as a distant symbol, but as the living Lord whose wounded heart remained open. The mercy she proclaimed was therefore Eucharistic. It flowed from the same Christ who gives himself in the sacrament. When Faustina approached Holy Communion, she believed she was receiving not an abstract promise, but the very source of the mercy she was asked to announce. The Eucharist taught her that divine love is self-giving. It does not remain safely enclosed within the heart of God. It enters the human condition, accepts suffering, and offers itself again and again for the life of the world. The Virgin Mary also appeared in Faustina's spiritual understanding as a companion in the work of mercy. Mary had received Christ and given him to others. In a different way, Faustina believed she was being asked to carry a message of Christ's compassion and place it before souls who needed hope. She did not see herself as equal to Mary, nor did she seek to draw attention away from her. Rather, she looked to Mary as the mother who could teach her how to remain hidden while serving a purpose greater than herself. The humility of Mary helped Faustina resist the temptation to measure the mission by visible success. If the world never recognized her, the offering could still be complete. In the spring of 1934, Father Sopochko arranged for the artist Eugeniusz Kazimierowski to paint the Divine Mercy image according to Faustina's description. The work took place in Vilnius, and Faustina visited the studio under the guidance of her confessor. The experience must have been both hopeful and painful. She was seeing an attempt to translate a sacred vision into human form, but no canvas could capture the fullness of what she had encountered in prayer. The image would remain imperfect, yet it became a sign through which people could direct their hearts toward Christ. Faustina's disappointment did not end the project. Instead, it became another lesson in surrender. God could use imperfect materials, limited artists, and uncertain beginnings. He did not require the work to be flawless before allowing grace to act through it. The painting was eventually placed for public veneration at the Ostra Brahma Shrine in Vilnius in 1935, and the devotion began to move beyond the quiet circle in which it had first been received. Still, Faustina's own life remained largely hidden. She continued her assignments, joined the community in prayer, and wrote when she was able. The contrast was striking. Outside the convent, an image was beginning to attract attention. Inside, the woman associated with it still washed, cooked, prayed, and endured her own limitations. Her name had not yet become widely known, and she did not know what the future would bring. With a simple pen and fragile pages, Faustina began preserving a conversation whose full meaning would only emerge after her death. The image had begun to leave the convent, but Faustina understood that a picture alone could not carry the whole weight of the message. People might look upon the face of Jesus and feel comfort, yet the heart also needed a way to respond. The devotion to divine mercy was therefore deepened through prayer, especially through the chaplet that Faustina received during a period of intense spiritual experience in Vilnius. The prayer came to her in a form that was simple enough for ordinary people to learn, yet profound enough to gather together the central mysteries of the gospel. It placed before God the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus Christ, offered for the sins of the world. In doing so, it directed the person praying away from self-reliance and toward the sacrifice of Christ. The chaplet did not ask the faithful to pretend that suffering was small. It asked them to place suffering within the greater mercy revealed through the cross. Faustina's concern was especially directed toward those who were dying. She had a deep compassion for people approaching the end of life, when fear, regret, loneliness, and the memory of sin can become more intense. She believed that no soul should be considered beyond the reach of mercy, even when a person had lived far from God or seemed unable to pray. Her intercession was often focused on these hidden moments, when a person might be surrounded by family or might be completely alone. She prayed for those whose names she did not know, and for those whose lives were known only to God. In her spiritual imagination, the chaplet became a prayer that could stand beside the dying when human words were inadequate. It was not a magical formula intended to control God. It was an expression of trust, a plea for grace, and a way of joining one's prayer to the sacrifice of Jesus. The language of the chaplet emphasized that mercy flows from Christ's wounded heart. It recalled the offering made on Calvary, where the Savior entered fully into human suffering and transformed death into the passage toward life. The person praying was invited to look upon the cross and to believe that the love revealed there was stronger than sin. This was not an easy belief. The world around Faustina was marked by political uncertainty, economic hardship, and the memories of war. Many people knew what it meant to lose a home, a relative, or a sense of safety. The chaplet entered this atmosphere as a prayer for a wounded age. It spoke to people who had seen cruelty and wondered whether goodness could still survive. It did not promise that history would become gentle immediately. It promised that human violence could not exhaust the mercy of God. Faustina also connected the message of divine mercy with the hour of Christ's death. The third hour of the afternoon, remembered as the time when Jesus gave his life on the cross, became for her a sacred moment of prayer. She encouraged people to pause when possible and remember the sacrifice through which mercy had entered the world. The hour was not meant to become a superstition or a rigid burden. Its meaning was relational. At 3 o'clock, the believer was invited to turn toward Christ and remain with him for a moment in gratitude, repentance, and trust. The day might be filled with work, noise, and responsibilities, but the memory of the cross could interrupt that movement and restore the heart to what mattered most. Faustina understood that the hour of mercy was not limited to clocks. It was a symbol of the moment when divine love appeared most completely within human suffering. Even people who could not stop precisely at 3 could unite themselves to that mystery through a brief prayer, a sigh, or an act of compassion. In this way, the devotion entered daily life without requiring extraordinary circumstances. A person could pray in a church, at a bedside, on a road, or in the middle of work. Mercy was not confined to a sacred building. It could be invoked wherever a human soul turned toward God. Faustina's teaching about mercy also resisted the temptation to keep devotion entirely private. She believed that a person who receives mercy must become merciful. Prayer without compassion would remain incomplete. The image of Christ with an open heart called believers to open their own hearts to the suffering of others. This did not require wealth or influence. A person could begin with patience, forgiveness, and attention. Faustina reflected on 3 forms of mercy that could be practiced through action, speech, and prayer. A person might help someone in material need, speak a word of comfort, or intercede when no other assistance was possible. The important thing was not the size of the deed, but the love with which it was offered. Mercy could be found in a convent kitchen, a crowded hospital, a family burdened by conflict, or a street where someone had been forgotten. It could be practiced through silence when gossip would cause harm, through listening when another person needed to be heard, or through forgiveness when resentment seemed justified. In this understanding, devotion to divine mercy became a way of seeing. It taught people to look beyond appearances and remember that every person carries an interior history known fully only to God. Faustina herself was tested by this teaching. It is easier to speak about mercy in the presence of strangers than to practice it with people whose habits irritate us. The convent gave her many opportunities to discover the difference between admiring compassion and living it. She had to forgive small injuries, tolerate misunderstandings, and respond to requests when she was tired. Her spiritual writings often returned to the need for a merciful heart, not merely a merciful vocabulary. She believed that Christ could use even a weak person if that person was willing to become an instrument of kindness. This was another reason she resisted attention. If people admired her more than the mercy of Christ, the purpose would be lost. The devotion was never intended to create a cult around Faustina. It was meant to direct souls toward Jesus, especially toward the sacraments and the life of grace. Confession occupied an important place in this spiritual vision. Faustina understood that people need more than reassurance. They need the courage to name their sins, receive forgiveness, and begin again. Mercy does not erase the truth. It allows the truth to be faced without despair. In the confessional, the soul does not bargain with God or purchase forgiveness through its own strength. It receives a gift that cannot be earned. Faustina wanted people who felt trapped in guilt to discover that the door of return remained open. She also wanted those who considered themselves good and secure to recognize their dependence upon grace. The Eucharist and confession stood together at the heart of her mission. One healed the soul through forgiveness, and the other nourished it with Christ himself. The chaplet, the image, and the hour of mercy were meant to lead people back to this sacramental life. Faustina's spirituality was therefore deeply rooted in the Catholic journey of faith. It was not an escape into private visions. It was a call to trust the Christ who is encountered in the church, in prayer, in the cross, and in the merciful service of neighbor. As the prayers began to spread among those who knew her, Faustina remained aware of her own fragility. She did not consider herself the source of the mercy she announced. She was a beggar carrying bread received from another. Her role was to place the message before the world and then allow God to work through it. At the hour when the day begins to fade, Faustina invited wounded souls to look again toward the cross. The prayer of mercy could travel quietly from one soul to another, but the image gave the devotion a visible form that people could carry into churches and homes. For Faustina, this development was both consoling and difficult. She had been asked to help make visible what she had seen in prayer, yet every attempt to translate a heavenly experience into human art revealed the limitations of human hands. The image painted in Vilnius by Eugeniusz Kazimierowski was created with care, but Faustina knew that it did not fully resemble the living face of Christ that had appeared to her. The expression seemed different. The proportions could not capture the mystery, and the painting remained only a representation. She felt a natural disappointment. If the image was meant to speak of mercy, how could it do so when it appeared imperfect? Father Sopoćko helped her understand that no picture could contain the fullness of Christ. A religious image does not replace the person it represents. It points beyond itself. The painted face could become a reminder, a door of memory, and a simple invitation to trust. But the grace would come from God, rather than from artistic precision. This distinction was important for Faustina, because she was being asked to surrender not only her fear of rejection, but also her desire for the result to match her private recollection exactly. She had seen something beyond the ability of paint to hold. The image would always be less than the vision, yet it could still become useful if it helped people turn toward Jesus. In the spring of 1935, the image was displayed publicly at the Ostra Brahma shrine in Vilnius during celebrations connected with the Jubilee of Redemption. For the first time, people outside the convent were able to see the figure that had been entrusted to Faustina. The event did not resemble the triumphant unveiling of a movement destined for immediate worldwide influence. It was a local act of devotion in a city filled with many religious images and competing concerns. People came, looked, prayed, and returned to their homes. Some may have been touched by the face of Jesus and the words beneath it. Others may have passed without understanding. Faustina did not know how many noticed the picture or what they thought of it. Yet she believed that even a single soul turning toward mercy would be enough to justify the effort. The image carried the title of Jesus, I Trust in You, and these words offered a direct response to the fears of the period. In a world where nations distrusted one another and ordinary families struggled to find security, trust could seem almost unreasonable. People wanted guarantees, protection, and control. The image offered none of these in the usual sense. It presented a Savior whose heart was open, whose hand was raised in blessing, and whose mercy could be received by those willing to surrender. The message did not deny danger. It asked people to place their fear into a larger reality. The image also invited people to look at Christ as the one who comes toward the sinner, rather than waiting for the sinner to become worthy. This did not remove the need for conversion. It made conversion possible by replacing despair with hope. A person who believes that God has closed every door may stop trying to return. A person who believes that mercy remains available can begin again. Faustina understood the difference through her own experience. She had often approached God aware of her weakness, uncertain whether she deserved to be heard. The image reminded her that the initiative belonged to Christ. Mercy was not a prize for the spiritually successful. It was a gift offered to those who recognized their poverty. After the public display in Vilnius, the devotion began to spread slowly through the efforts of Father Sopoćko and others who had encountered Faustina's message. Copies of the image were made, prayers were shared, and small circles of devotion formed. The growth was uneven. Some people were drawn to the picture immediately, while others questioned its origin or worried that private revelation might be receiving too much attention. The Church's caution remained present, and Faustina accepted that caution as part of the process. She did not want the devotion to move faster than discernment permitted. A message intended for the whole Church had to pass through the ordinary structures of the Church. Priests needed to examine the writings, images, prayers, and spiritual effects. The faithful needed to be protected from exaggeration. Faustina's own humility helped preserve this balance. She did not claim that everyone must accept every detail of her experiences. She believed that the central truth was already found in the Gospel, that God is rich in mercy, and that Christ calls sinners to trust, repentance, and love. The image was meant to serve that truth, not to stand apart from it. Faustina sometimes wondered whether the imperfect painting could truly fulfill the command she believed she had received. Her concern revealed how seriously she took the mission. She did not treat the image as a personal possession. She felt responsible for presenting it faithfully, and any difference between the vision and the painted form weighed upon her. Yet through prayer, she gradually accepted that God often works through imperfect instruments. The apostles were not flawless. The first disciples misunderstood Christ, acted from fear, and struggled to believe. The scriptures were carried through human languages and human memory. The sacraments themselves used ordinary material things, water, oil, bread, and wine, to communicate divine life. If God could act through such humble signs, he could also work through a painting that no artist could make perfect. This realization softened her disappointment. The image did not need to satisfy every artistic expectation. It needed to help the viewer remember the open heart of Jesus. This acceptance also reflected something deeper in Faustina's spirituality. She was learning to surrender the difference between what she wished to offer and what she could actually accomplish. She wanted to give God a perfect response, but she possessed only a human response, limited by weakness and circumstance. The temptation to wait until everything was flawless could become another form of pride. God was not asking her to create perfection. He was asking her to remain faithful. The same lesson applied to the people who received the image. They might pray imperfectly, repent slowly, and practice mercy inconsistently, yet God could begin with the small trust they were able to offer. The picture became a meeting place between divine generosity and human poverty. As copies of the image moved from Vilnius to other places, the devotion entered homes, chapels, and personal prayer corners. A family could look upon the face of Jesus during illness. A person grieving the loss of someone could pray before the image. Someone burdened by guilt could read the words beneath it and consider the possibility of return. The image did not speak through sound, yet it offered a language understood by people who might not possess theological education. The raised hand suggested blessing. The rays suggested life and cleansing. The open heart suggested that mercy was not locked away. Even those who could not explain the symbolism could feel that the face was asking for trust rather than fear. Faustina remained aware that images could be misunderstood. Some might treat them as objects that guarantee protection without conversion, while others might admire the beauty and forget the message. For this reason, she continued to emphasize the relationship between devotion and action. To look at the merciful Jesus was to become more merciful. To pray for forgiveness was to forgive. To receive compassion was to become willing to offer it. The image could not replace a changed life. It could only invite the change to begin. In the convent, Faustina continued her ordinary work, while the image moved outward. Her hands still performed tasks that seemed unrelated to the spiritual movement growing around her. She was not present at every place where the picture was displayed, and she did not try to control what people said about it. Her role was to remain faithful to the source of the message and to accept that the future belonged to God. What began as a humble painting slowly became a window through which countless people would remember that Christ had not abandoned them. The image was beginning to travel beyond the places Faustina knew, but the body that carried the message was becoming increasingly fragile. For years, she had experienced weakness, fatigue, and recurring illness. Yet she continued to fulfill her duties whenever she could. Religious life required perseverance, even when the body protested. A sister still had to rise for prayer, appear at the appointed time, and complete the task entrusted to her. Faustina often tried to hide the extent of her discomfort, not because she believed suffering should be denied, but because she did not want to become a burden to the community. Her desire to remain useful sometimes led her to continue working beyond her strength. Over time, however, the signs could not be ignored. Her coughing became more persistent, her energy diminished, and the ordinary duties that had once been manageable demanded increasing effort. The illness that would eventually be recognized as tuberculosis began to shape the rhythm of her life. Tuberculosis was a frightening disease in the early 20th century. Treatment was limited, recovery uncertain, and the illness often carried the loneliness of separation. Those who were sick might be sent away from the community, not because they were unloved, but because others feared infection and hoped that rest and fresh air might help. For Faustina, the illness brought a new form of hiddenness. She had entered religious life intending to serve, but now she was often unable to work as she wished. The kitchen, garden, and daily responsibilities continued without her. Other sisters had to assume tasks that she could no longer perform. The loss of usefulness was painful. A person who has built an identity around service may struggle when the body no longer allows service to take the same form. Faustina had to learn that she remained valuable even when she could not produce anything visible. The truth was difficult, because the world, and sometimes the human heart, tends to measure worth by activity. The sick person can feel forgotten, dependent, and guilty for needing care. Faustina's illness invited her into a deeper understanding of grace, one in which receiving became as important as giving. She had spent much of her life serving others. Now she had to allow others to serve her. This required humility of a different kind. It meant accepting meals, treatment, rest, and assistance without believing that dependence was failure. She had to surrender the desire to decide when she was strong enough to return to work. Medical examinations and periods of treatment interrupted the familiar pattern of convent life. She was cared for in facilities connected with the Sisters of Our Lady of Mercy, including treatment near Krakow, where doctors tried to slow the progress of the disease. The atmosphere of a place for the sick was different from the atmosphere of a convent. There were other patients, other forms of suffering, and the constant awareness that recovery could not be assumed. Faustina encountered people whose illnesses were visible and people whose pain remained hidden. Her compassion for the sick deepened, not as a theory, but through shared vulnerability. She knew what it meant to wait for a doctor, to listen to one's own breathing, and to wonder whether the next day would be easier or worse. Illness also changed her experience of prayer. When she was healthy, she could offer God the energy of her work. When she was weak, prayer itself could become an effort. She might wish to remain recollected, but find that coughing, pain, or exhaustion broke her attention. The body insisted upon its limits. Faustina learned that a distracted prayer could still be sincere, and that a person could be united with Christ without feeling spiritually elevated. The Eucharist became especially precious during these periods. When she was able to receive Holy Communion, she approached the sacrament with the awareness that Christ entered not an ideal version of her, but the actual person she had become through illness. He came to the room where she was weak, to the body that could not work, and to the heart that feared the future. The Eucharist did not always remove the symptoms, but it gave her a place to rest her suffering. She believed that the same Christ who had offered himself upon the cross was now offering himself to her in sacramental silence. The connection between the Eucharist and her illness became a source of endurance. She did not need to understand every pain in order to unite it with Christ. She could simply offer the day, the breath, the waiting, and the uncertainty. This offering was not a rejection of medical care. Faustina accepted treatment and hoped for relief. She did not believe that trusting God required refusing the help provided through physicians and ordinary means. Her spirituality held together prayer and responsibility. She sought healing, while remaining open to the possibility that the illness might not disappear. This balance was important. To accept suffering does not mean that suffering is desirable. It means that when suffering arrives, it need not become meaningless. Faustina did not praise disease for its own sake. She regarded physical weakness as a painful condition. Yet she believed that grace could enter it. The cross did not make pain good in itself. It revealed that love could remain present within pain. Her illness also placed limits on her ability to continue the external work connected with the divine mercy message. She could not travel widely or address large groups. She could not supervise the spread of the image or ensure that people understood the devotion correctly. Much of what she had been asked to do now depended upon Father Sopoćko and others. This dependence was another purification. Faustina had to believe that the mission could continue without her direct control. The message belonged to Christ, not to her strength. If the image was meant to reach people, God could carry it forward through other hands. If the writings were meant to be preserved, they could survive the weakness of the person who had written them. The thought may have comforted her, but it also demanded surrender. A mission is easy to claim when one can act. It becomes more difficult when one can only pray and wait. Faustina's periods of treatment were marked by interior struggle as well. The illness sometimes intensified her fear of death, even though she longed to be united with God. The human heart can desire heaven and still tremble before the process of dying. She worried about leaving the community, about unfinished duties, and about whether her message had been misunderstood. These concerns did not contradict her faith. They revealed the natural affection she had for the people and the life God had given her. She had not become indifferent to earthly existence. She still appreciated companionship, prayer with the sisters, and the possibility of offering some small service. Yet she gradually learned to place these desires in the hands of God. The possibility of death became less an interruption and more a continuation of the surrender she had practiced throughout religious life. Each day of illness asked the same question in a new form. Could she trust Christ when her strength was disappearing? Could she believe that her life retained meaning even when she was no longer active? Could she accept that prayer offered from a bed might be as fruitful as work performed in public? The answers did not always come through feelings. They came through repetition, through returning to the same words, and through accepting the next moment. Jesus, I trust in you became not only the inscription beneath an image, but the quiet discipline of her sick room. When she could not do much, she could still trust. When she could not explain the future, she could still offer it. When she could not see the results of her mission, she could still remain faithful to the one who had given it. Her strength diminished, but her trust became quieter, deeper, and more complete. The physical weakness that had entered Faustina's life was accompanied by another kind of suffering, one that could not be measured by a physician or relieved by rest. As her illness progressed, the interior consolations that had sometimes strengthened her also became less frequent. The presence of God, once felt with great clarity, seemed to recede behind a veil. Faustina entered a period of spiritual darkness in which prayer required faith without reassurance. She had spoken of mercy to others, but now she was being asked to trust mercy when her own soul felt empty. The experience was not a sign that God had abandoned her. It was a purification of the way she relied upon God. A faith supported by consolation can feel strong, yet a faith that remains when consolation disappears becomes something deeper. Faustina had to discover the difference between loving God for the peace he gives and loving God even when peace is withheld. The distinction was painful. She did not want to become spiritually indifferent, nor did she wish to exaggerate her suffering. She simply found herself unable to summon the warmth that had once made prayer seem easy. The chapel remained the same. The tabernacle remained in its place. The prayers of the church continued with their familiar words. Yet within her, the sense of distance could be almost overwhelming. She prayed because she had promised to pray, because the community prayed, and because Christ had asked her to remain faithful. She did not pray because every prayer brought immediate relief. This was the school of trust in its most demanding form. Faustina's interior darkness was made more difficult by the knowledge that she had a mission to fulfill. If she had been living only for herself, she might have withdrawn into silence and accepted that no one understood her. But she believed that the message of divine mercy was meant for countless souls. She wondered whether she was failing them. Perhaps she had not written clearly enough. Perhaps the image had not been made accurately. Perhaps the people who encountered the devotion would misunderstand it. Perhaps God would choose another messenger. These questions returned with greater force as her health weakened. She felt the tension between the importance of the mission and the smallness of her own abilities. In her imagination, the future of the devotion seemed to rest upon fragile human decisions, yet she knew that she could not control any of them. The temptation to take responsibility for everything was another burden she had to surrender. A servant is asked to be faithful, not omnipotent. Faustina gradually learned that the work did not depend upon her anxiety. If Christ truly desired mercy to be proclaimed, he could provide the means. Her task was to offer what she had been given and to leave the outcome with him. This was not easy. The human mind prefers visible plans, reliable schedules, and evidence of progress. Faustina was often given none of these. She could not look ahead and see the millions who would one day pray the chaplet or stand before the image. She could see only a few people who knew the message, a confessor trying to discern it, and a body growing weaker. Faith required her to believe in a harvest hidden within the seed. The writings she left behind often reveal this movement between confidence and fear. She would describe the mercy of God with extraordinary certainty, then acknowledge her own hesitation. She could express the conviction that Christ was near, then admit that she felt abandoned. These apparent contradictions were not signs of dishonesty. They showed the depth of the spiritual life, in which the soul can hold truth and pain at the same time. Faustina knew that God was merciful, but she did not always feel safe. She knew that Christ had called her, but she did not always feel worthy. She knew that death could lead to eternal life, but she still trembled before suffering. Grace did not erase her humanity. It entered her humanity and taught her how to surrender it. Her relationship with the cross became increasingly personal. She did not seek pain, and she did not believe that illness made her superior to those who were healthy. But she understood that Christ's love had passed through suffering, and she wished to unite her own suffering with his. When she could no longer serve in the same way, she offered the incapacity itself. When she was misunderstood, she offered the pain of being unseen. When prayer felt dry, she offered the effort to remain present. When she feared death, she offered the fear. These offerings were not always accompanied by peace. Sometimes the act of surrender had to be repeated many times within a single day. The cross became not only an event remembered in prayer, but a pattern of consent. Faustina also found support in the Virgin Mary. Mary's presence during the Passion offered her an image of faithful endurance. Mary could not prevent the suffering of Jesus, nor could she explain why it was permitted. She remained near. Faustina saw in this nearness a lesson for her own life. She did not need to solve every mystery. She needed to remain close to Christ. The Mother of Mercy became for her a companion in the school of silence. When words failed, Faustina could turn toward Mary and remember that the most important acts of love are not always spoken. Sometimes love remains at the foot of the cross, unable to change the circumstances, but unwilling to leave the suffering person alone. Her obedience to Father Sopoćko remained important during these years. He continued to help her distinguish between genuine spiritual movements and the fears or imaginings that could arise from illness and exhaustion. Faustina did not always find the guidance easy. There were times when she felt a strong interior command and then had to wait for permission or clarification. Yet she accepted the discipline. She believed that God would not be offended by her obedience to legitimate authority. If an experience came from Christ, it could withstand patience. If it came from herself, patience would expose it. This conviction kept her from making impulsive decisions. It also protected the devotion from becoming centered upon private enthusiasm. The message of mercy was being placed within the life of the Church through a process that included prayer, examination, and surrender. The darkness also taught Faustina compassion for those who felt spiritually abandoned. Before experiencing it herself, she could speak of despair as a condition to be overcome. Now she knew how heavy the darkness could become. She understood that some souls do not reject God because they are proud. They may be unable to imagine that God could still desire them. They may carry memories of sin, abuse, loss, or failure that make hope feel impossible. Faustina wanted to stand beside these souls through prayer. She believed that Christ's mercy reached even into places where a person could not yet feel it. Her intercession became a form of hidden companionship. She prayed for those who could not pray, trusted for those who could not trust, and offered her suffering for those who felt forgotten. In doing so, she became more closely identified with the heart of the message she carried. Divine mercy was not merely something she described. It was something she was learning to embody. There were moments when the darkness seemed to threaten everything. Her health weakened, her future narrowed, and the work she believed she had been asked to begin remained uncertain. Yet she continued to return to the Eucharist, to confession, to prayer, and to the words of trust. The repetition might have appeared simple to an outsider, but it demanded courage. A person does not repeat an act of surrender because it has become meaningless. One repeats it because the heart is still learning. Faustina's trust was not a single heroic decision made once and preserved forever. It was renewed in the morning, at midday, during the night, and in every hour when fear returned. The closer she came to the end of her earthly road, the less she possessed except the trust she had repeated so often. The darkness did not last forever, though it left Faustina changed. As the final months of her life approached, the path before her became narrower in outward terms and wider in spiritual meaning. She returned to the convent in Krakow, where the sisters cared for her with the tenderness and concern appropriate to someone whose illness had become serious. The city itself continued to move around them. People went to work, children walked through the streets, bells marked the hours, and ordinary life carried on without knowing that a young nun was quietly preparing to leave the world. Faustina's room became a place of waiting. She rested there, received treatment when possible, and remained in contact with the sisters and priests who came to assist her. The work that had once filled her days was now largely beyond her strength. She could not garden as before, could not participate in every task, and could not move easily through the house. Yet her attention did not turn entirely inward. Even in weakness, she remained concerned about other people. She prayed for the sisters, for the church, for sinners, and for those who were suffering without anyone to remember them. Her illness had taken away much of her physical freedom, but it had not taken away the capacity to love. In fact, the limitations of the sick room gave her a new way to serve. She could intercede, she could offer her pain, she could receive those who needed encouragement. She could remind others that God had not withdrawn from the suffering. The spiritual mission she had received was becoming less dependent upon action and more dependent upon presence. A person near the end of life often discovers that presence itself can become a final ministry. Faustina's presence was quiet. She did not seek to make her death into a lesson for others, nor did she speak as someone who had mastered every fear. She remained a woman who loved Christ and who was still learning how to surrender. The sisters who saw her could observe the physical signs of tuberculosis, the thinness of her body, the exhaustion in her face, and the effort required to speak or move. Yet they could also see an interior seriousness that did not crush her gentleness. She was not detached from the people around her. She could still smile, listen, and respond with kindness. Her holiness did not make her less human. It made her humanity more transparent. The approach of death also brought questions about the mission she had been asked to carry. The image had been painted, the prayers had been written, and the devotion had begun to spread. But Faustina could not know what would happen after she was gone. She had no guarantee that the movement would remain faithful to the message. She could not foresee the theological investigations, the misunderstandings, or the eventual worldwide recognition. From her room, the future appeared hidden. She had to entrust the work to Christ in the same way she had entrusted her health. This surrender was perhaps the final expression of her vocation. She had spent years learning that a messenger does not own the message. Now she had to believe that the mission could continue without her voice. Her writings could be misunderstood, lost, or ignored. The image could be rejected. The prayers could remain limited to a few people. Yet none of these possibilities could cancel the faithfulness with which she had responded. The value of an offering does not depend entirely upon the results seen by the person who gives it. Faustina's task was to give herself. The harvest belonged to God. During her final period, the sacraments became increasingly precious. Confession gave her the assurance of forgiveness and helped her approach death without pretending that she had no weaknesses. The Eucharist united her to the Christ, whose mercy she had spent her life proclaiming. When she received Holy Communion, the sacrament gathered together the whole pilgrimage of her life. It recalled the child who had first approached the altar in a Polish village, the young woman who had searched for a convent, the sister who had worked in kitchens and gardens, and the mystic who had been entrusted with a message for the world. All of these stages were present in the simple act of receiving Christ. The Eucharist did not erase the memories of suffering. It placed them within the larger offering of Jesus. Faustina also received the sacrament of the sick and the care of the Church as her condition declined. These rites were not signs of defeat. They were ways in which the community accompanied her toward the final passage. Catholic faith does not ask the dying person to face death alone. The Church brings prayer, anointing, forgiveness, and the promise of Christ's presence. Faustina had spent her life praying for the dying. Now she was surrounded by the same mercy she had asked for others. This reversal must have touched her deep. She was accustomed to being the intercessor, the one who offered prayers for souls in need. Now she was receiving the prayers of the community. She had to allow herself to be carried, just as she had once tried to carry others. The humility of receiving completed the humility of giving. As her strength diminished, Faustina's thoughts increasingly turned toward eternity. She did not speak of death as an escape from every difficulty, nor did she deny the natural fear that accompanies it. She understood death through the cross and resurrection. Christ had passed through suffering and entered glory, and she hoped to follow him. Yet hope did not mean that the process would be painless. She remained aware of leaving behind the people she loved and the community that had become her home. Religious life had formed her through its ordinary relationships, and separation from those relationships could not be treated lightly. The sisters were not simply witnesses to her final days. They were part of the story she was completing. She had served them, struggled with them, forgiven them, and received their care. In the end, the convent became the place where her entire vocation came together. The hidden life that had begun with humble duties now ended with an equally humble surrender. Faustina's concern for souls did not fade as she approached death. She continued to pray that people would trust in divine mercy, especially those most burdened by sin and despair. Her greatest desire was not that people remember her name, but that they turn to Christ. She wanted sinners to approach confession, the sick to find comfort, and the fearful to believe that God's love was stronger than their past. She knew that many people resist mercy because they believe their sin is too great or their wounds too deep. Her own suffering had taught her that the human heart can remain afraid even when grace is offered. She therefore prayed with patience for those who could not yet accept hope. Her intercession was not dramatic. It was the quiet work of a soul standing before God on behalf of others. As autumn came to Krakow in 1938, the days shortened and the air grew cooler. The changing season offered a natural image of Faustina's life. The world outside moved toward winter, while within the convent the sisters prepared for a farewell that they could not postpone. She was 33 years old, the same age at which Christ's earthly life had reached its apparent defeat before the resurrection revealed its meaning. Faustina's own life seemed small and unfinished. She had not traveled widely, written books for the public, or held a position of influence. Yet the hidden work of grace is not measured by the standards of visibility. Her diary, her prayers, and her suffering had become an offering whose future she could not see. On October 5th, 1938, Faustina's earthly life came to an end. She died in the convent in Krakow, surrounded by the spiritual care of the Church and the presence of those who had accompanied her. The moment was quiet, without the spectacle that often surrounds famous deaths. A young nun, whose name was known only to a small circle, passed from the visible world into the mercy she had trusted. Her body was laid to rest in the convent cemetery, and the community returned to its daily life, carrying the absence of one of its members. She had once feared that no one would understand her mission, but now she was learning that the mission no longer belonged to her. For a time after Faustina's death, the convent seemed to return to its ordinary rhythm. Yet the absence of her presence could not be ignored. The sisters continued their prayers, work, meals, and responsibilities. But one voice had fallen silent. The woman who had spent so much of her life trying to remain hidden had now disappeared from the daily life of those who knew her. Her writings remained, along with the image, the chaplet, and the memories of those who had spoken with her. These things were fragile. A diary can be set aside. A painting can be misunderstood. A prayer can remain within a small circle and never travel beyond it. Nothing seemed to guarantee that the mission entrusted to Faustina would become known. Father Sopoćko understood the importance of preserving her writings and continuing the work of promoting divine mercy. But he also knew that the future would not be simple. The world was entering one of the most violent periods in modern history. Europe was moving toward war, and the Polish people would soon suffer devastation on a scale that made every personal plan uncertain. In such circumstances, a message of mercy might have seemed easily overwhelmed by the noise of armies, occupation, fear, and death. Yet precisely because the world was wounded, the message began to find a deeper resonance. The prayers associated with divine mercy spread among people who were living with the reality of loss. Families prayed the chaplet for those taken away by war. The image of Jesus became a source of comfort in homes marked by grief. People who had no power to stop violence could still ask for the conversion of hearts and the salvation of souls. The devotion did not erase the horrors of history, but it offered a language through which suffering could be placed before God. Father Sopoćko continued to write, preach, and encourage the devotion as circumstances allowed. He knew that Faustina had not wished to create a private association detached from the Church. The devotion needed a sound foundation in Scripture, the sacraments, and the Catholic understanding of mercy. He therefore tried to present the message carefully, even while political conditions made communication difficult. The war disrupted ordinary life, restricted travel, and placed many religious activities under pressure. Poland's churches, convents, and families experienced surveillance, deprivation, and danger. The future of Faustina's writings was uncertain. Manuscripts could be lost, destroyed, or scattered. People who had known her were themselves exposed to suffering. The work continued not through a secure institution with abundant resources, but through the persistence of individuals who believed that the message deserved to survive. After the war, the devotion began to reach more people, especially in Poland and neighboring countries. The image was reproduced, the chaplet was prayed, and small groups gathered around the theme of Christ's mercy. Yet expansion also brought new questions. Faustina's writings had passed through translation, transcription, and interpretation. Some phrases were difficult to render accurately in other languages. Certain expressions could appear theologically imprecise when removed from their context. The Church had to consider not only the sincerity of Faustina, but also whether the published forms of the devotion represented her message faithfully. This process reflected a long-standing Catholic concern. Private revelations may encourage devotion, but they must be examined carefully so that the faithful are not led into confusion. In the years after Faustina's death, not everyone who promoted divine mercy understood the need for this discernment. Some may have emphasized extraordinary promises without the corresponding call to repentance and charity. Others may have treated the image and chaplet as guarantees of protection rather than invitations to trust and conversion. These problems made the Church cautious. The central message of mercy was soundly rooted in the gospel, yet the forms through which it was communicated required careful review. In 1958 and 1959, Vatican authorities issued decisions that restricted the promotion of the devotion in the forms associated with Faustina. The action was connected in part with concerns about inaccurate translations, misunderstandings, and the need to investigate the theological content of her writings. For those who loved the devotion, the decision was painful. It seemed that the voice of the woman who had proclaimed mercy was being silenced. Yet the restriction was not a declaration that God could not show mercy. It was a judgment concerning the way a particular message had been presented and understood. The distinction was difficult for many people to grasp. A devotion can be temporarily restricted while the truth at its heart remains. The Church was not rejecting the mercy of Christ. It was seeking to ensure that the private experiences attributed to Faustina were evaluated responsibly. The restrictions created a period of uncertainty that lasted for years. Copies of the diary could be difficult to circulate, and public promotion of the devotion was limited. Some people who had prayed the chaplet in secret continued to do so. Others set the writings aside, unsure whether the message could be trusted. Faustina's name faded from public attention in places where it had once been spoken with enthusiasm. The woman who had wished to remain hidden seemed to disappear once again. But the story did not end in silence. In Poland, the devotion continued quietly among those who had encountered its spiritual power. Prayers were not always announced. Images remained in homes and chapels. People continued to turn toward Christ in moments of fear, illness, and death. The message endured not because it had been protected by publicity, but because it answered a need within the human heart. People knew that they required forgiveness. They knew that the wounds of war, ideology, and personal sin could not be healed through political solutions alone. They needed to believe that God's mercy was greater than the forces destroying them. The patience of those who preserved the devotion during the period of restriction became another form of hidden faithfulness. They did not demand immediate recognition. They waited for the Church to complete its investigation. This waiting was difficult, but it resembled Faustina's own path. She had learned that a mission can pass through delay without being defeated. The image might be set aside, the writings might remain unread, and the prayers might be whispered by only a few, yet God could still be working. Providence often moves through periods that appear unproductive. The seed disappears beneath the soil before anyone can see the life within it. During the following years, renewed attention began to be given to Faustina's writings and to the question of whether the earlier concerns had resulted from defective translations rather than from the original text. Scholars and church authorities examined the available manuscripts, compared versions, and considered the spiritual fruits associated with the devotion. The process was slow because the Church needed to protect both truth and the faithful. It was not enough to say that many people found comfort in the message. Comfort alone could not establish authenticity. The writings had to be understood in harmony with Catholic teaching, and the devotion had to lead people toward Christ rather than toward fascination with a visionary. Gradually, the picture became clearer. Faustina's message centered upon the mercy revealed in Scripture and made present through the sacraments. Her insistence on trust was inseparable from repentance, confession, Eucharistic devotion, and acts of mercy. Her diary did not offer an easy spirituality that ignored suffering. It described the cost of discipleship and the necessity of humility. The more carefully her writings were studied, the more evident it became that the heart of her mission was not novelty. It was a renewed proclamation of the gospel. The turning point came through the work of people who believed that Faustina's message deserved a fair hearing. Among them was a young Polish priest named Karol Wojtyła, who would later become Pope John Paul II. As a priest and bishop in Krakow, he became familiar with the devotion and with the testimony surrounding Faustina. He recognized that the message of divine mercy spoke with particular force to a world marked by war, totalitarianism, and the wounds of the 20th century. Yet, the story still had many steps to travel before the Church would publicly affirm Faustina's sanctity. Her name was beginning to return, but recognition had not yet arrived. The silence was beginning to break, though softly. For a time, it seemed that the voice of the hidden nun might once again be hidden. Yet silence is not always defeat. Sometimes it is the quiet soil in which a greater work is taking root. The quiet soil in which Faustina's message had rested began to show signs of life through the people who continued to study, preserve, and pray. In Krakow, the young priest, Karol Wojtyła, became increasingly attentive to the writings and testimony connected with the deceased nun. He had lived through the violence of war, the destruction of his homeland, and the ideological systems that sought to deny the dignity of the human person. The message of divine mercy spoke directly into that historical wound. It did not offer a shallow optimism that evil was harmless. It proclaimed that no human failure, however grave, could place a person beyond the reach of God's invitation to return. Wojtyła saw in Faustina's life a witness that could help the Church speak to a world exhausted by cruelty and fear. As Archbishop of Krakow, he supported a careful investigation into her life and writings. The process required patience, documents, testimony, theological examination, and the study of the original Polish texts. The Church had to determine whether Faustina had lived the virtues of faith, hope, charity, prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude in a manner worthy of imitation. It also had to examine the spiritual meaning of her experiences and the fruits that had emerged from the devotion. The process was not a simple confirmation of popular enthusiasm. It was a gradual inquiry into whether the message she carried truly led people toward Jesus Christ and the life of the gospel. The earlier restrictions on the devotion remained part of this history. They were not ignored or explained away. Instead, the Church revisited the questions that had created difficulty. The original writings were compared with translations, and the meaning of expressions was considered within the whole of Catholic teaching. This work revealed that some confusion had resulted from inaccurate translations rather than from the heart of Faustina's message. The central themes were consistent. God's mercy is revealed in Christ. The sinner is called to repentance and trust. The sacraments remain essential. Mercy received must become mercy offered. Suffering can be united with the cross. These teachings did not create a new gospel. They returned the faithful to an ancient truth that the human heart repeatedly forgets. As the investigation advanced, Faustina's reputation for holiness grew beyond Poland. Her diary was translated into other languages and read by people who had never heard of the village where she was born. The image of the merciful Jesus appeared in churches, homes, hospitals, retreat houses, and places of prayer. The chaplet was prayed by families, religious communities, prisoners, the sick, and those accompanying the dying. The devotion crossed cultural boundaries because it addressed experiences shared by every people. Every society knows guilt, grief, injustice, fear, and the longing to begin again. The message did not erase the differences between nations, but it gave people a common language of compassion. A person in one country could pray the same words as someone on the other side of the world and feel joined to a community larger than geography. In 1993, Faustina was beatified by Pope John Paul II. The ceremony confirmed publicly what many had already believed privately, that the humble nun from Poland had lived a life of heroic virtue and had become a faithful witness to Christ. Her beatification did not make her a distant figure belonging only to the past. It brought her closer to the ordinary faithful. She had not lived in a palace or led a movement through worldly influence. She had worked in kitchens, gardens, and convent rooms. She had known illness, doubt, and misunderstanding. Her path remained accessible to those whose lives were hidden. Beatification allowed the Church to say that holiness can grow in places the world overlooks. It can be formed through repetitive duties, patient suffering, and the decision to trust when no visible reward appears. 7 years later, on April 30th, 2000, Faustina was canonized by Pope John Paul II in Rome. The ceremony took place on the Sunday after Easter, a day now associated throughout the universal Church with divine mercy. The choice of that day expressed the relationship between Faustina's mission and the Paschal mystery. The mercy she proclaimed was not separate from the death and resurrection of Christ. It flowed from Easter, from the victory of life over sin and death. Her canonization confirmed that the message had passed through the necessary discernment and could be offered to the entire Church as a source of spiritual nourishment. Divine Mercy Sunday became an occasion when Catholics around the world were invited to reflect upon the compassion of Christ, to seek forgiveness, and to practice mercy toward others. Yet the feast was not intended to reduce mercy to one annual celebration. It pointed toward a way of life. Faustina's message asked the faithful to carry mercy into every day, every relationship, and every hidden decision. The impact of her witness has continued to grow in spiritual, social, and cultural ways. The chaplet is prayed in hospitals beside the beds of the dying. It is prayed by people facing addiction, grief, imprisonment, and loneliness. The image has become familiar even to those who know little about the details of Faustina's life. Some people encounter the message through a parish devotion, others through a retreat, a family member, or a moment of personal crisis. The words, "Jesus, I trust in you," have become a quiet answer for those who cannot control what lies ahead. They remind people that trust is possible even when circumstances remain painful. Faustina's influence also extends into the practice of mercy. Her writings have inspired works of charity, ministries for the poor, prayer groups, and efforts to accompany the sick and forgotten. The devotion cannot remain authentic if it becomes only a private comfort. It must open the heart toward concrete love. The world has enough people who admire mercy in principle while withholding it in practice. Faustina's legacy challenges this contradiction. She asks whether the person who receives forgiveness is willing to forgive, whether the person who seeks compassion is willing to show compassion, and whether the person who prays for the suffering is willing to draw near to someone who suffers. Her message does not permit the faithful to remain spectators. It draws them into the work of healing. This work is often hidden. A mother may show mercy by remaining patient with a difficult child. A husband and wife may practice mercy by choosing reconciliation instead of keeping a record of injuries. A nurse may offer dignity to a frightened patient. A stranger may notice someone whom others ignore. A person wounded by another may begin the long process of forgiveness without denying the seriousness of what happened. These actions rarely enter history books, yet they participate in the same spiritual reality Faustina sought to serve. The apostle of divine mercy did not become influential because she possessed worldly power. She became influential because she allowed grace to pass through weakness. She had no public platform during her lifetime, no institution under her command, and no certainty that her writings would survive. Her authority came from faithfulness. She accepted the tasks given to her, endured the suffering permitted in her life, and returned again and again to the trust that had first been placed beneath the image of Jesus. Her story also offers a needed correction to the way holiness is often imagined. Holiness is not always accompanied by health, recognition, or visible success. It may look like a sick woman writing by candlelight, a nun washing dishes, a young servant waiting outside a convent, or a frightened soul repeating a few words in the dark. God's work can remain hidden for years, even decades, before the world recognizes what has been given. Faustina's life began in a poor Polish village and ended in a convent room. Yet between those two quiet places, she carried a message that crossed languages, nations, and generations. The child Helena had learned to pray beneath the bells of a rural church. Sister Faustina later learned to pray beneath the weight of illness, doubt, and responsibility. In both places, the essential movement was the same. She turned toward Christ and trusted that mercy was greater than fear. Her story leaves the listener not with the demand to imitate every mystical experience, but with an invitation to imitate her surrender. The most important question is not whether someone will receive visions or perform extraordinary deeds. It is whether, within the life already given, that person will allow mercy to become real. If Christ could use a hidden nun whose strength seemed so limited, then no life is too ordinary to become an offering. If forgiveness could reach Faustina through the Eucharist, the cross, and the patient guidance of the Church, then forgiveness remains possible for those who feel far from God today. Saint Faustina's final lesson is simple and demanding. Trust is not the denial of sorrow. Mercy is not the denial of truth. Holiness is not the absence of weakness. All three become real when a human heart places its poverty into the hands of Christ and refuses to close itself to love. The child from Głogowiec, the servant who waited, the sister who worked in hidden places, and the dying woman who entrusted her mission to God are one person, carried through every season by grace. Her life returns us to the image that first changed her path, the face of Jesus, the open heart, the rays of mercy, and the words that continue to cross the night with quiet strength. Jesus, I trust